A voice comes to one in the dark, imagine, to one on his back in the dark. This he can tell by the pressure on his hind parts and by how the dark changes when he shuts his eyes and again when he opens them again. Only a small part of what is said can be verified, as, for example, when he hears you are on your back in the dark. Then he must acknowledge the truth of what is said, but by far the greater part of what is said cannot be verified, as, for example, when he hears you first saw the light on such and such a day. Sometimes the two are combined, as, for example, you first saw the light on such and such a day, and now you are on your back in the dark. A device, perhaps, from the incontrovertibility of the one to win credence for the other. That, then, is the proposition. To one on his back in the dark, a voice tells of a past, with occasional allusion to a present and more rarely to a future, as, for example, you will end as you now are. And in another dark, what is the same, another divide or accompany, quick leaving. Use of the second person marks the voice, that of the third, that conquers other. Could he speak to and of whom the voice speaks, there would be a first, but he cannot. He shall not. You cannot. You shall not. Apart from the voice and the faint sound of his breath, there is no sound, none at least that he can hear. This he can tell by the faint sound of his breath. Oh, now, lest the never given to wonder, he cannot but sometimes wonder if it is indeed to and of him the voice is speaking. May not there be another with him in the dark, to and of whom the voice is speaking? Is he not perhaps overhearing a communication not intended for him? If he's alone on his back in the dark, why does the voice not say so? Why does it never say, for example, you saw the light of such and such a day, and now you are alone on your back in the dark? Why? Perhaps for no other reason than to kindle in his mind this faint uncertainty and embarrassment. active at any time is now even less than ever so. This is the type of assertion he does not question. You saw the light on such and such a day. Your mind, never active at any time, is now even less than ever so. Yet a certain activity of mind, however slight, is a necessary complement of company. That is why the voice does not say, you are on your back in the dark and have no mental activity of any kind. The voice alone is company, but not enough. Its effect on the hearer is a necessary complement, were it only to kindle in his mind the state of faint uncertainty and embarrassment mentioned above. But company apart, this effect is clearly necessary. For were he merely to hear the voice, and it to have no more effect on him than speech in Bantu or in Erse, then might it not as well cease, unless its object be by mere sound played one in need of silence, or, of course, unless, as above, surmise directed at another. A small boy, you come out of Connolly's store, holding your mother by the hand. You turn right and advance in silence southward along the highway. After some 100 paces, you head inland and broach the long step homeward. You make ground in silence, hand in hand, through the warm, still summer air. It's late afternoon, and after some 100 paces, the sun appears above the crest of the rise. Looking up at the blue sky, and then at your mother's face, you break the silence, asking her if it is not in reality much more distant than it appears. The sky that is, the blue sky. Receiving no answer, you mentally reframe your question, and some 100 paces later, look up at her face again, and ask her if it does not appear much less distant than in reality it is. For some reason you could never fathom, this question must have angered her exceedingly, for she shook off your little hand and made you a cutting retort you have never forgotten. If the voice is not speaking to him, it must be speaking to another. So, with what reason remains his reasons? to another of that other, or of him, or of another still, to another of that other, or of him, or of another still, to one on his back in the dark in any case, of one on his back in the dark, whether the same or another. So, with what reason remains, he reasons, and reasons ill. For were the voice speaking not to him, but to another, then it must be of that other it is speaking, and not of him, or of another still, since it speaks in the second person. Were it not of him to whom it is speaking but of another, it would not speak in the second person, but in the third. For example, he first saw the light on such and such a day, and now is on his back in the dark. It is clear, therefore, that if it is not to him the voice is speaking, but to another, it is not of him either, but of that other, and none other, to that other. So, with what reason remains, he reasons ill. In order to be company, he must display a certain mental activity, but it need not be of a high order. Indeed, it might be argued the lower the better, up to a point.
The lower the mental activity, the better the company, up to a point.
You first saw the light in the room you most likely were conceived in. The big bow window looked west to the mountains, mainly west, for being bow. It looked also a little south and a little north, necessarily. A little south to more mountain, and a little north to foothill and plain. The midwife was none other than Dr. Haddon, struggling grey moustache and hunted look. It being a public holiday, your father left the house soon after his breakfast with a flask and a package of his favourite egg sandwiches for a tramp in the mountains. There was nothing unusual in this, but on that particular morning his love of walking and wild scenery was not the only mover, but he was moved also to take himself off and out of the way by his aversion to the pains and general unpleasantness of labour and delivery. Hence the sandwiches, which he relished at noon, looking out to sea from the lee of a great rock on the first summit scaled. You may imagine his thoughts before and after as he strode through the gorse and heather. When he returned at nightfall, he learned to his dismay from the maid at the back door that labour was still in swing, despite its having begun before he left the house, full 10 hours earlier. He then hastened to the coach-house, some 20 yards distant, where he housed his idiom bouton. He shut the doors behind him and climbed into the driver's seat. You may imagine his thoughts as he sat there in the dark, not knowing what to think. Although footsore and weary, he was on the point of setting out anew across the fields in the new moonlight, when the maid came running to tell him it was over at last. Over. You are an old man plodding along a narrow country road. You have been out since break of day, and now it is evening. Sole sound in the silence your footfalls, rather sole sounds, for they vary from one to the next. You listen to each one and add it in your mind to the growing sum of those that went before. You halt with bowed head on the verge of the ditch and convert into yards. From the basis now of 2 steps the yard, so many since dawn to add to yesterdays, to yesteryears, to yesteryears. Days added today and so akin, the giant taught in miles, in leagues. How often round the earth already, halted too at your elbow during these computations, your father's shade, in his old tramping rags, finally on side by side from naught and new. The voice comes to him now from one quarter, and now from another, now faint from afar, and now a murmur in his ear. In the course of a single sentence may change place and tone. Thus, for example, clear from above his upturned face, you first saw the light at Easter, and now. Then a murmur in his ear, you are on your back in the dark. Or, of course, vice versa. Another trait, its long silences, when he dare almost hope it is at an end. Thus, to take the same example, clear from above his upturned face, you first saw the light of day, the day Christ died, and now. Then, long after, on his nascent hope, the murmur, you are on your back in the dark. Or, of course, vice versa.